Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Agile Strategies Insights video podcast. You know, in order to have an Agile organization, you need to cultivate Agile leaders, and that's what this session is about. I'm Daniel Montgomery, the founder and managing director of Agile Strategies, and today we're talking about leadership agility with the foremost expert on that subject, Bill Joyner. In fact, the person who defined the term leadership agility. Bill's a global thought leader in the world of Agile leadership. Building on his doctorate in leadership and organization development at Harvard, he has over 3 decades of experience as an organization change and team development consultant, and as a leadership educator and coach. Following the publication of his book, Leadership Agility, which I highly recommend, he's expanded his practice to include training hundreds of coaches, including many Agile coaches, in leadership agility coaching and the Leadership Agility 360 assessment and the Leadership Agility Accelerator, which is a self-assessment tool. He's the CEO of ChangeWise and is based in the Boston area. He can be reached at bj@changewise.biz. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate your inviting me to be part of your podcast series.
Thank you. It's great to have you. So I know you've got a few ideas to just kick this off. So
yep.
Go through that, share your screen, and then we'll have some dialogue about it when you're done. So I invite you to share your screen and let's get into leadership agility.
All right. Yeah, I wanted to share with you the framework that we use in helping leaders become more agile. And then I think that'll kind of make it easier to have some conversation about it. So I will just share my screen, and there we go. So, oops. The first, I want to start by just calling out the environment that we're operating in today, which is very much an environment that requires leadership agility. So most of you probably heard this term, VUCA. It's the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment that we find ourselves in today. Now, of course, with the pandemic on top of everything else, some people call it VUCA squared. We'll probably move on to VUCA cubed before too long. So this is a really important consideration in thinking about the kind of leadership we need today. The book that Daniel referenced was written to discover there's like 5 years of research that went into it. So when we set out to do it, we wanted to understand, how do highly agile leaders think, how do they act, and how do they develop greater agility? So what I'm going to be covering in this little short presentation is something about the business payoff of leadership agility, and then get into what leadership agility is, beginning with what I call the core practice of leadership agility, which is something you can do starting tomorrow. And then I'm going to get into, I think, what to me is the most interesting dimension of the leadership agility framework, which has to do with the levels of agility that leaders can grow through as they become more agile. And an interesting thing about this is that the vast majority of leaders are not at the 3rd level yet, and yet this is where they really need to be given our environment. So just a little bit more on the context. I believe the VUCA environment is being generated by 2 powerful global trends. One is the fact that not only is change, are things moving very rapidly, but the pace of change is actually accelerating, and it's doing so in a wide variety of sectors and industries. The second big global trend that's driving the need for leadership agility is that everything's becoming more interconnected, right? So this slide here highlights the more macro trends that are creating more and more interconnection. And leaders face this on a daily basis, regardless of what level they are in the organization. For example, to get products out the door faster, different functions need to collaborate horizontally much more than they have in the past. That's part of growing interconnection. So leaders have to be really good at dealing with those kinds of situations. To put what I just said into a different graphic format, where we have the pace of change in one dimension and the growing interdependence and complexity on the other, we can tell a simplified story that, once upon a time, these factors were at a pretty low level. And then they reached a moderate level. And think of the last half of the last century, perhaps. During that era, strategic planning became a necessity that wasn't the necessity before that. But today we are in a unprecedented era where the pace of change and the degree of interconnection is extremely high. Now, if we look at this in the context of organizational performance, there's some, I pulled together different sources of research on the topic of organizational agility that used a variety of approaches from academic studies to case studies and more. And the unanimous, consistent conclusion from all of that research is that the more agile the organization, meaning the better it is at dealing with the two forces I just mentioned, the higher the business performance. And that's just measured on the traditional measures of business performance. Now, how do you create an agile organization? Well, that's a whole nother webinar, but I'll just say briefly that there are two high-level components that are essential. One is that you need a structure and set of methods that promote agility. But the other thing you need is agile leadership and leadership culture. And unfortunately, a lot of the agile transformations, at least as these started out, were not paying sufficient attention to this second circle. Now, I think the more the agilists and others who are really on the cutting edge of creating agile organizations are paying a lot more attention to the leadership and culture dimension. And on that topic, we did some additional research after we wrote the book and basically found the following. The higher the level of agility in what we call the leadership culture, meaning the part of the organizational culture that sets norms for what kind of leadership is expected and rewarded around here, the higher the level of agility there, the greater the organization's agility, and the better the business performance. So that's a very striking business case for what leadership agility can do. Now, that all begs the question, what exactly is leadership agility? At its core, and I'm going to talk about these different levels of agility, but for each level, at its core is a practice called reflective action. So in my view, for leadership agility, you need more than an agile mindset. You need to be able to reflect and act in iterations as an individual. And so one way of talking about this is that it's sort of like having a zoom lens on a camera. So most of the time we get into a leadership task, we get highly focused on that and everything else recedes into the background. The middle process of reflective action is one of being able to step back from that focus, like you're zooming out, and see more about the context that surround it, more about the stakeholders that surround it, other important factors. And from that stepping back to gain a broader, deeper perspective on what you were focusing on. Then it involves bringing the insights you gain from that into action. So it's not just an awareness process, it's an action process. It's a reflective action process. So that's something that, well, we'll talk more later about how do you develop your agility, but this is a core practice for that. Now, going back to this idea of agility levels, what we found in our extensive research is that there are 3 levels of agility that are relevant to today's managers, called expert, achiever, and catalyst. And the reason they've been put onto this graphic, which was our graphic for how the environment is evolving, is that we found that leaders operating at the expert level can be quite effective if the pace of change is fairly low and the degree of interdependence, for example, the need to work with stakeholders, is also low. But to operate in an environment of moderate change and complexity, it's the achiever leaders who are capable of strategic thinking and others related capabilities. It takes that level of leadership agility to be effective in that environment. Now, unfortunately, that environment is hardly any longer with us. We're now in an environment where catalyst leadership is the one where leaders are most effective on a sustained basis and also the least likely to burn out in dealing with today's environment. Now, the percentages on here are important because it's a research-based estimate of how many managers are now operating at these different levels. 55% are not operating beyond the expert level. That's a problem. And 35% achievers and 10% catalysts. So while it's true that this is a situational leadership model in the sense that there may be situations where even if you're capable of catalyst leadership, you want to downshift to achiever or downshift to expert. If you don't have the capacity to work at the catalyst level, that can be limiting and frustrating in dealing with today's environment. What's behind these levels is an understanding of, it comes from a field called stage development psychology, sometimes called vertical development. And you see here that it goes back to really the early part of the last century, the research on this, although there was a ton that kicked in the last couple of decades of the last century, particularly on more advanced stages of adult development, which were initially not understood. Where we focus is on the expert achiever catalyst, because this is by far the most relevant. But what I want to emphasize here is it's not just a matter of adopting new behavior. It's also a matter of evolving your emotional intelligence and your cognitive capacities. And there are specific ways that these develop as you move through these stages. So it's important in developing, helping leaders develop greater leadership agility to pay attention both to the outside in dimension, in other words, how are they actually behaving, but also the inside out dimension of how are they processing their experience. Another thing I want to clarify about these levels is that these are not different types. Typologies are like MBTI or DISC or Enneagram are very valuable in understanding differences between people, and but this is not that kind of a framework. What we find is that given any type framework, you're going to see all different types at each level. So the good news about that is that catalysts are not limited to a particular personality type. You find personality types of all kinds at the catalyst level. Okay, so coming back to these 3 levels of leadership agility, I want to just, as I wrap up this little presentation, I want to just give you put some more meat on the bones as to what does an expert leader do and so on. So starting with the expert level, I'm going to talk about 4 things about each level. First is, what's the assumption about what leadership is? Secondly, what's the approach to leading organizational change? what's the approach to leading teams, and what is the approach to what I call pivotal conversations, which is challenging conversations where you don't see eye to eye, but you have to resolve differences. So coming back to the assumption about leadership that that's held at the expert level, this is not necessarily what somebody would articulate or espouse. It's more like the assumption that you can infer from their actual behavior. So in this case, it is leadership is all about being respected and followed because you have the authority and or you have the expertise. When leading organizational change, the expert approach is tactical. The focus is on incremental change, and it tends to be limited to whatever is within your span of authority. Your engagement with stakeholders at the expert level tends to be pretty minimal. Team leadership. Expert leadership does not really create teams in the sense that most of us would describe it. What it creates are hub and spoke relationships where the leader is primarily relating to their direct reports one-on-one, and they are not really trying to develop their direct reports into a full team. They're not really even seeing them as a system. They tend to see the individuals without seeing the connections between them. And finally, in pivotal conversations, there's at this level, a fairly low tolerance for dealing with differences. And so the tendency is to either be highly assertive or highly accommodative, meaning letting the other person at least outwardly get what they need. In other words, very high advocacy or maybe asking a lot of questions, but not really revealing your own position. So that's the expert level. And I think you can see why that is not the most effective approach in today's environment. Yet apparently a majority of today's leaders are working at this level and not beyond it at the current time. Now, achiever leadership is quite different. The assumption is that leadership is about motivating people and making it both challenging and satisfying for them to contribute to larger objectives. When you're leading change, now you have a strategic approach and you're focused on outcomes. Your focus on outcomes makes you more flexible than you were at the expert level in terms of how things are done. So as long as they get to that outcome, that's what really matters. Looking at, in leading organizational change, the approach is to survey the environment, pick up on changes that are emerging, and periodically make changes, strategic changes that will address those new realities. And there's a big focus on getting buy-in from stakeholders. Team leadership is now what we would recognize as a leader really developing a team. They're trying to help them not only follow them as individuals, but how all of them work together in the service of larger objectives. And then pivotal conversations, we have a more moderate tolerance for differences. So even though the style may be primarily assertive or primarily accommodative, the achiever leaders can always bring in some degree of the opposite style to somewhat balance what we call the power style, the way in which people resolve differences with others. And finally, we have the catalyst level. And here, the assumption is that leadership is all about articulating and inspiring vision. Now, that alone doesn't make it totally different than achiever, because the achiever has you could say they have a vision, but it's really a set of strategic objectives. So an inspiring vision and then empowering and developing others to make it a reality. In leading organizational change, catalyst leaders do what one called aiming through the target. And what he meant was the target would be the strategic objectives. So while he was definitely wanted to hit those targets, he was simultaneously working to develop the capacity of the organization, not only to meet the current strategic challenge, but to meet any strategic challenge that might come along. And a key aspect of that not the only piece, but a really important piece, is developing an organizational culture that is participative, empowering, and encourages authentic, constructive, straight talk. In team leadership, Catalyst leaders really began the organizational change process by creating the kind of culture I just described among their direct reports. Among that team, it becomes a very high-performing team that can really lead change together and can model the culture that they're trying to bring about. And then in pivotal conversations, we have this ability to both advocate one's own views and to inquire and genuinely take in and consider other views, and to really move back and forth very fluidly between those, which is an ideal approach for creating true dialogue. So as a final slide here, I'll mention that if you use this framework to think about your own leadership or your client's organization and their leadership, a couple of things to keep in mind. Leadership agility levels are not totally fixed, in that you may have somebody, let's say, generally speaking, at the achiever level, but they may do some things at the catalyst level and some at the expert level. But there is a center of gravity that leaders tend to come back to in terms of one of these three levels. In our view, anyone can develop new levels of leadership agility given the right circumstances, which includes, of course, a growth mindset on the part of the leader and the right kind of challenge and support from the organization. It's important to remember that as leaders move through this sequence of levels, they don't lose anything. They retain the capacities they had at previous levels, and that's what allows them, when needed, to downshift to previous levels, and then back to sort of their home base. So this is not so much about, as important as it is to have more catalyst leaders, it's not about doing everything from the catalyst level. It's about expanding your repertoire so that if you have the catalyst capacities, this allows you to operate at any of the three levels of agility. So that is kind of a overview of the framework. And Daniel, I'll be happy to talk with you about what does all this mean and how do you think about it?
Yeah, there's so much there, Bill. I guess I'll just I may even kind of start where you ended and work my way back with some
Sure.
questions or areas we could explore a little more. I mean, this idea that if I'm a catalyst, I'm retaining the capacities of an expert and an achiever. So, I mean, are you saying that implies that I actually need to have gone through becoming a healthy expert leader in order to move into achiever and then a healthy leader there? Because I mean, that's an idea that I studied Don Beck's spiral dynamics for a number of years and had some interviews with him. And he really emphasized that, like you actually have to be healthy at one level in order to move into the next. And do you see that operating in this way?
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, in a sort of informal sense, I think of each level as sort of having three phases. You know, there's sort of the entry level, starting to learn to operate at the next level, and then there's sort of being able to reliably operate at that level, and then there's sort of like you've mastered it, and those are the people who are best positioned to move on to the next level. So, and as you're implying, you can't skip levels. Nobody's ever come up with an example of somebody who went from expert to catalyst. And I think you can understand that if you think about some of the previous levels, like in childhood, right? You wouldn't have somebody go from kindergarten to high school.
Right.
You know, just you don't have social issues aside, it doesn't you wouldn't have the cognitive and emotional capacities to handle high school at that point.
Right.
So it's sort of analogous to that.
Yeah. So like, for instance, moving out of expert level, if I'm, say a little bit neurotic about needing people to recognize my expertise and, say, oh, yes, you know so much about this, whatever it might be, then it seems I've almost got a level of anxiety that's getting in the way of moving into being an achiever. I think I've got to, yeah.
Part of what drives the expert level is it's when we identify with our expertise. We sort of think of it as being equivalent to us. So, for example, if you challenge my expertise and I'm identified with it, that's going to feel pretty threatening, right? Because you're going to the core of who I am, at least in my perception.
Yeah.
Right? But if I can hold my expertise, and we're not saying there's anything wrong with expertise. Expertise is great. It's about relating differently to it so that you can move to a place where it's more like you have expertise, and you can recognize others' expertise, and you realize that you're in an environment where whatever you know may or may not be true anymore because everything is changing so rapidly, right? So it's like the people who are working for you are, their job is to keep up with the nitty gritty of how everything's changing, and you need to be in a position to, empower them and facilitate their work, which is very different than being a doer yourself.
Yeah, well, it seems like, just jumping ahead briefly to Catalyst, it seems like if I'm a boomer, for instance, I've got a particular set of mental models that were formed in earlier stages of my career, which were happening in the 70s, 80s, 90s. So literally the millennials may actually have different mental models because of the way they grew up and the way their brains got wired as children and teenagers and what they moved into as young adults. So it would seem as a catalyst, I really need to be prepared to hear their perspective on things and, let go of control, don't I?
Yeah. You need to provide clear expectations, but then you want to use that to create a space for people to operate more autonomously and not always having to, an expert leader, people usually feel they have to constantly check in with them. Because everything is being directed by them at such a sort of microscopic level. And their meetings may be meetings I call searchlight meetings. So I think everybody's been in these meetings at some time or another. There are meetings where the leader says, okay, now we're going to hear from R&D. How are things going there? What are the problems there?
Right.
And then we move to manufacturing. And, you can see everybody who's not in the searchlight pulling out their phones or otherwise not really being engaged. And part of this is driven by the core capacity that gets developed as you move through these levels is this ability to zoom out and take in larger perspectives. And so if I'm really zoomed in, I'm not as attentive to other perspectives, other ways to see what I'm focusing on.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that begins to develop much more at the achiever level is, you recognize you can't do everything by yourself. You need to get buy-in from people. You need to understand where they're coming from. And so that creates a very different approach to leadership. And then that deepens a lot more at the catalyst level.
Yeah, and I've got a hypothesis, because we work with OKRs, which I think that's in that circle you labeled agile structures and methods. And I see like that can't exist independently of agile culture and leadership. And we talk about that with our clients all the time, because it seems to me like even the way you have a meeting, we talk about OKRs as a team sport. We don't recommend that they be used for individual performance appraisals and compensation and those kinds of things. That's really something you want to decouple those things. So it seems to me that having at least some level of ability at the achiever level would be important in order to be successful with OKRs, because, right, you want to have meetings where it's not going around the table and everybody's got their own portfolio that's
Right.
what they're concerned with and they want to get their airtime. You want more of a collaborative conversation about
Right.
shared outcomes. And I
Right.
think you need an achiever leader to foster that kind of environment, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. Absolutely right.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, yeah, it's OKRs are most effective at least at achiever level, and then beyond that with catalyst level, especially if you don't want to be top down about the way that you create OKRs. You
Mhm.
actually want to set out a vision and then have people come to you with, okay, we're the R&D team and this is where we see contributing to this larger vision that we've got. And
Mhm.
like to really get to that level would require a catalyst, I think.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm working with a small software company now where that's what's happening. I mean, over time, uh, their senior leaders have developed a lot of capacity for um, catalyst level leadership,
Mhm.
and that has enabled them to create. They are putting in place a lot of the agile structures and procedures, methods, um, and they're able to create a culture that really supports that. And still a work in progress for sure, but that makes a huge difference. Um, in what they can accomplish, which has been a lot.
How have you and they encouraged or cultivated that kind of growth, assuming that
Mm,
you're starting with, mostly experts and maybe some achievers, and if you're like moving the whole
mhm.
leadership population up this scale, what do you do to engender that?
Well, the primary approach we've used there is we use our Leadership Agility 360, which is a tool that's based on the framework I just presented. And that helps them to, it's not just a matter of, okay, which level of agility am I at? It's helps them identify very specific areas where they want to improve and uh, gives them specific practices that help them move to the next level of agility.
Mhm.
So that sort of, it's a very robust action plan that comes out of that 360. And then there's coaching that, they usually pick 3 things to work on initially. And the coaching helps them to do that. And there's, I could go into more detail about how that works, but that's been the primary engine with that client. I've also done some work with the executive team as a team, and in terms of, because I think that's important, so that what people are working on individually is getting translated, that you sort of get the synergy of what everybody's doing together, and they're looking at how are they holding their meetings and how can they improve them, etc.
Mhm. Also curious about in the years you've been working on this, this is maybe a little far-fetched, but has this model been in place long enough that you can detect from data any evolution in the workforce toward, like if we're at 10% catalysts now, were we at 7% 20 years ago, and do we think we'd be at 15, by
Mhm.
2030? Any evidence of that?
Well, I would say generally speaking, there's not, we don't really have evidence that on a broad scale that's changing. I think it takes these very intentional efforts like the one I was just describing to really shift agility levels.
Mhm.
It's not something you can just read about and do. It's you're developing yourself as well as your leadership. Um, I mean, we do have, like, there's a company that has used our Leadership Agility 360 as part of a leadership development program. It's like a Fortune 200 company, and they wanted to revamp their already very good leadership program for people who were moving to the executive level. And they did something unusual in my experience for most companies. They did pretty extensive research on the outcomes. So not only did they were looking, they felt that this framework would help their leaders develop certain desired behaviors that they had identified. And so they did qualitative interviews about those like 6 months later. So it's like, if this is going to stick, what is sticking? And they also ran the 360 again and looked at, was there movement in terms of a level of agility? And they had very good outcomes on both scores. Consequently, they used it for about 10 years.
Mhm.
So we do see when the conditions are right, leaders become more agile. They move upward through that, through those levels. But I don't think that the environment alone is going to, but besides creating conditions where people are compelled, it becomes more and more obvious that the way we've been leading is not going to serve us in today's environment, much less in tomorrow's environment. It's providing that kind of service, I'd say, to and putting more attention on the need for this kind of development. But the environment sort of, there's other ways to react to this environment, which really don't take you in the desired direction. I think as we get more pressure, more speed, more need to work closely with others. One way to react to that, and in sort of automatic way, is to zoom down.
Yeah.
Just kind of put your head down and push. And so that's part of why I say I think the environment could drive us either down or up, in terms of development. And that's
sense.
why I think it's important to provide leaders with an understanding of what other, we've come across a number of leaders who've said basically, I've been very successful, but I sense that there's some other kind of leadership that must be there somewhere that I want to learn, but I have no idea what it is.
Mhm.
And I think this is one thing that this framework is helping people do is, first of all, have a vision of what it looks like. And then, of course, we have to provide the challenges and supports that are conducive to this kind of development.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think, I was thinking about that too, just even in the kind of the global political realm. I think as things are getting more chaotic, more confusing, you do see some regression. You see like this disturbing emergence of so many autocratic leaders in countries that had been previously more democratic or showed the promise of that.
Right.
And similarly in organizations, I was just talking to a client this morning that there are times when an organization goes into crisis and maybe you need to be more of an expert, top-down command and control type leader. This was a case where, when COVID hit, it's like, okay, we need to batten down the hatches. This is what we need to do. We need to be just all focused on a team of doing this one thing that I, as the leader, am telling you that we have to do. Then the question is, can you lighten up and ascend when you need to, or do you stay locked into that model where you end up in a country like Russia, where there's this cultural presumption that we need an autocratic leader in order to keep this country together?
Yeah.
Or can you lighten up? And personally, I think that's actually a difficult thing to ask of a leader. It's tough.
Well, two quick examples of the sort of what I call downshifting. One I can think of is a CEO I was working with who discovered there were a lot of problems with the marketing organization that had not come to light before. And his marketing VP was not really dealing with it as effectively as needed. So in collaboration with that leader, he sort of started digging into what was going on in the marketing organization. Now, because he tended to operate generally at more of the catalyst level, it was important for him to signal what he was doing and why. This is a temporary thing I'm doing. I need to look into this for these reasons, kind of on the lines of what you were saying. And this is going to come to an end. My sort of digging into the organization is going to stop, and it's not going to take forever for that to happen. So I think that's a good being able to sort of meta communicate about what you're doing when you're shifting those levels, so people don't get confused or feel like they're getting mixed messages. And then another example was with someone who was leading a frontline healthcare group in the very worst of the COVID outbreak. And of course, they were very nose to the grindstone. But what they were able to do, what this person was able to do, was to periodically like take an hour where everybody stepped back. And they talked about how they were feeling, and they talked about how this was not how they were always going to operate in the future, that they're doing this now for this reason, and to kind of add some reflective process to what they were doing, which when you get in really an expert mode, you're reflective. There's not that much reflection going on. There's just a lot of reacting. And it can be, as we all know, you can get burned out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that whole concept of the capability for reflective action, for stepping back and pausing and getting the big picture. I mean, I thought too, I mean, on the structure side, that's why OKRs are so much more powerful than a 5-year strategic plan, because there's got to be a constant challenging of what assumptions led us to believe that this plan would get us where we need to go, and are those still true? And getting people to shift into a different mode of conversation in order to do that, and to recognize, we're in that kind of observational assessment conversation as opposed to a solutioning conversation or a reflective conversation, or an action-oriented who's doing what, what's the game plan kind of conversation. And I think being able to shift those levels and have those different kinds of conversations is a really positive evolution.
Yeah. I mean, I think if I understand it right, that the way in which you work with OKRs or your clients work with them is a reflective action process. It's a group or team reflective action process.
Right.
And, like you say, like so much of the Agile approach, it's moving in iterations. And each iteration has an action and a reflective component to it.
Right. Exactly. Well, I feel like we could go on all day here, Bill, but I know you need to get going, and so really appreciate you taking the time to present this to us. And I just think this is a really useful model for people to consider.
Well, thank you, Daniel. It's been fun talking with you. The time for me has flown by. I just want to mention a couple of things. One is that the Leadership Agility book is available on Amazon. And for those of you who are leadership coaches or Agile coaches, our next 360 certification workshop is September 28th through October 1st. And if you want to learn more about that, just email me at bj@changewise.biz. And we also have a leadership agility coaching program, which is a multi-month, once a week virtual, like 2 or 2.5 hours each week, which Dan has participated in. And so that'll be coming up soon as well. If you want to learn more about that, I'll be happy to share information.
Great. And it's quite rigorous with lots of practice, lots of role playing. I can vouch for that. Very thorough kind of program. Okay, well, thanks very much for joining us, Bill.
Thank you, Daniel. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, take care.